Hi there guys, got a video here for you today on the AGT Vulcan 3, and what we're going to be doing in this video is making a new shroud for the rifle. Before we get into that though, I do just very briefly want to mention that I will be attending the Northern Shooting Show and I'm going to be working on the Crawley Surplus Store stand. So if you want to come up and say hello or browse through the deals that the Crawley Surplus Store are going to be putting on, please come up and have a look at the stand. With that said, onto this video, and we're going to be making a new shroud. To be honest with you, I really like the factory outside shroud here, so we're actually going to be keeping this piece and making a new inner core. The inner core will be a little quieter and also have a 1/2 inch UNF on the end instead of the factory M14 by 1.25. Now I have already gone ahead and made the core, so here it is here. There are just a couple of things I want to point out before we get started. So first off, we're going to be making the core in two pieces, so this rear section here, and then this front cap at the front. For me personally, anodizing a piece of this sort of size is a little tricky, so we're going to be breaking it up in two pieces, and then what I'll do is I'll leave this part here bare aluminium. Then we'll anodize the front cap so it's nice and black to match the shroud. The core itself is a direct replacement for the factory one. It screws on the barrel here using the M14 by 1.25 thread, and at the other end we have a 1/2 inch UNF, so we can put either a moderator, or for this rifle I'm going to be making a new muzzle brake. With that all said, I'll take you over to the lathe and I'll show you how I made this piece here. Right then, over to the lathe, the first thing we're going to be making is the front cap. To do that, I've got a piece of aluminium, roughly 38mm in diameter, chucked up in the lathe, and the first thing we're doing is turning down the end to accept the 1/2 inch UNF. The major diameter for 1/2 inch UNF threads is 12.7mm, so we're just turning the end down to that. There is a fair amount of material removal in this video, so I have cut a bit of it out, but I do leave a few full passes in there just so you can see what's happening. Once we've turned the end down to 12.7mm, we can work on the other features of the thread, such as the undercut and the chamfer on the end. The undercut just provides a nice place for the threads to run into and gives a defined stop. On these threads here, the large diameter that you see at the back of the threads is the reference face. So when you screw your moderator on, the back of the moderator needs to butt up against the front edge of the shroud, and that's what aligns it with the bore. The threads obviously have a little bit of axial alignment, but the main reference face is the rear face. With that all said, we've got our threading tool in the lathe, and we're just putting the thread on the end of the piece. Once we get the threads cut to near the right depth, we can bring over our 1/2 inch UNF go gauge and test fit that on the end. The go gauge needs to screw onto the threads nice and freely without too much play. We're just taking a few passes and checking it with a gauge. Once we get close, we can give the threads a little polish up, and then again bring back our go gauge and make sure everything fits as it should. With that said, we can chuck up a female 1/2 inch UNF mandrel in the lathe, then screw our front cap into the mandrel and start work on the rear features. The first thing we need to do is turn the end down to 16mm, and this will house an internal M12 by 1 thread, but we'll get that done very shortly. Next we have to put a large diameter thread on the very end of the front cap. That's an M35 by 1.5 thread, and this will just screw into the aluminium shroud housing. In this piece I don't want a super tight fit, as there are a couple of O-rings in this piece and I don't want it to be difficult to remove if we have to take it apart for any reason. We get in the tube to fit, then taking a few spring passes over the piece, just to loosen up the threads very slightly. We don't want a sloppy fit, but we don't want a tight fit either. With that done, we can start work on the M12 by 1 features, and the first thing we need to do is drill the end out to 10mm, then come through with a boring bar and bore the end out to 11mm. We're using a boring bar in this application because we want a nice parallel hole that's perfectly on center. To be honest with you, you could easily use a drill bit for this part, but as we've gone to the trouble of chucking everything up in the 1/2 inch UNF mandrel, and I want everything to run nice and true when we screw the end piece onto the core, I've done it with a boring bar. but with it bored out to diameter, we can put a small chamfer or lead into the threads, then thread the piece M12 by 1. I'm just using a tap for this part here. So we're starting the tap off in the lathe, then finishing the threads out by hand. With that said, that's the front cap pretty much complete for now. The next thing we can work on is the shroud core, and this is the piece that houses the baffles. So we've got a nice big piece of stock chucked up in the lathe, and we're just working on one end for the moment. This end will screw onto the barrel, so what we need to do with this is face the end of the stock, then we can drill and bore the piece out to 12.75mm, which is tap-in size for M14 by 1.25. As always, to find the tap-in size of a metric thread, it's nice and easy. All you have to do is minus the pitch from the diameter. So M14 minus 1.25 is 12.75mm. I do like to give those dimensions a tiny bit of clearance, so on this piece here we're boring the piece out to 12.8mm. Now this thread here is a little different from the one that we cut on the end of the front cap, in that it doesn't have the reference face at the rear of the threads. The reference face is a small step within the bore, and that butts up against the nose of the barrel. What we did to form this step was simply drill the piece out 10mm to about 25mm deep, and come through with our boring bar, bore out to our tapping size to around 17mm deep. That creates a small step in the bottom of the bore, and that's what butts up against the front edge of the barrel. But once we've got those features established and have a little bit of a chamfer on the start of the threads, we can tap the piece out. We're using a machine tap for this, and again I'm just starting that in the lathe, then finishing it off by hand. These machine taps force the chips out of the hole and produce a really nice finish. With that done, the next thing we have to do is start work on the other features of the core. To do this, what I needed to do was mount a M14 by 1.25 male mandrel in the 3-jaw chuck, check it was running true, and then screw our core onto it. This is the setup from which all of the other features will be machined, and doing it this way just ensures that when we screw the core onto the barrel, it will be perfectly aligned with the threads. Once this was done, the first thing we needed to do was put a center mark in the end, and that allows us to install a live center and support the work while we turn the outside features. With our tailstock support installed, the first thing I done was just take a quick pass over the OD to take it to rough dimensions. The OD of this piece here will be 34.5mm, and the stock diameter that we're using is 38mm. The middle of this piece here is going to be turned down to a much smaller diameter, so instead of working on the whole diameter all at one time, I chose to focus on the ends first, getting them to where they needed to be, and then we can turn out the middle at a later date. So we're turning the ends down to 34.5mm, then coming through and putting some layout lines on the piece so I know where all of the features are roughly going to end up. The next feature we can put on is the small spigot at the front of the piece. This will be 16mm in diameter to match the spigot on the front cap, and house a male M12 by 1 thread on it, again matching the front cap. So a fair amount of material has to come off the front of the piece, and we're just turning that down nice and quickly. Once the ends turn down to 16mm, we can start work on the thread features. And again, that just includes turning the diameter down to 12mm, putting a thread gutter in, chamfering the start, and then turning down a little bit of the waist support material. With that all done, the last thing to do to the front of the piece is to put on the M12 by 1 thread, and again we are just putting this on with our lathe tool, single point cutting the threads with a full form cutter. Now the cutters that we're using in this video are cutting both the root and the crest of the threads, so the top and bottom, and they produce a really nice finish. So we're just putting the thread on with nice light passes with plenty of WD-40 as cutting oil, and then once we reach our thread depth, we can come back through with our end cap and test fit it on the piece. And as you can see there, it fits really quite nicely. With the front side done, we can start work on the back, and the first thing we need to do is remove most of the waste material. Removing the waste material just removes a little bit of weight from the actual moderator core and gives the air more room to expand. So we're just turning this end piece down to 17.5mm, and then we can stick on a nice decorative angle. The angle that we're putting on here is just a 30-degree angle, so nice and steep. And it just makes the back of the core look a little nicer, as well as, again, removing a little bit of material for the weight. With both ends complete, we can now start work on the center. The first thing we need to do is groove out a start point for the lathe tool, and we're just doing that with a nice grooving tool. The diameter in the middle of the piece is going to be roughly 27mm, so we need a fairly deep groove. You don't necessarily need a start point for the lathe tools, but it does make their job a little easier, and it relieves some of the pressure on the part, as instead of cutting on both the in-feed and the side feed, we're only really cutting on the side feed. Once we've got the start and finish grooves established, the next thing we can do is just put a small O-ring groove in this back section here. This O-ring isn't really a sealing O-ring, it's more of an insulation O-ring to stop the metal shroud rattling against the metal core. So this just needs to be a nice snug fit within the shroud. Again, we're just taking that out with our grooving tool. With that done, the next thing we can do is remove the waste material from the center, and this little turned down section here will just house the felt. So we're going to be wrapping this core in a small amount of felt, and hopefully that should do two things. Firstly, make the shroud core a little quieter, and secondly, take out some of the metallic ping in the shroud itself. In my experimentation with shrouds and moderators, the actual sound of the air hitting the side walls of the shroud or moderator also produces a fair amount of noise. To help reduce this, putting a layer of felt around the outside just helps insulate the metal or carbon fiber shrouds and makes them a little quieter. Once we have all the waste material removed from the center, we can test fit our felt, and this is just high density black felt from Amazon, roughly 3mm thick. But as you can see there, the felt is nice and flush with the outside diameter, so the felt should go in nice and easily and be held in place by both the front and back baffles. With that all done, we can drill out the center of the shroud. This is probably the longest and most tedious job of the whole project, but it's the one that's probably the most important. So to do this, the first thing we need to do is come through with a 5mm drill, and this is just a standard length tin drill. And what we're going to be doing with this is creating a nice pilot drill for the long drill bit to follow. So we're using our standard length drill to drill around 40mm deep, and then we can come through with our extra long 5mm drill bit and go the rest of the way. The pilot drill just helps keep the long drill on center and starts it off with a nice guide hole. And as you can see here, what we're doing is just taking nice shallow pecks with our long drill, clearing out the chips and then adding some WD-40 and then taking another small peck. I'm advancing the drill about 3mm each time, and every now and again you'll see me put my fingers on the sides of the drill. This is just to detect any undue vibrations or wobbling, as once the drill starts going off center, it's incredibly difficult to get it back on again. Typically speaking, if the drill starts to wander off center, you need to stop drilling from this side, remove the core from the mandrel, and start going through from the other side. The other thing that you may be able to do if you catch it soon enough is come through with a larger drill bit, drill down to your current depth, and then restart your long drill bit. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't, depending on how off-center you are. Once we've broken through with our 5mm drill bit, we can come through with our 6mm drill bit and just open out the holes. To be honest with you, a 5mm drill bit should be okay for the shroud. However, I always drill the shrouds and the moderators out to 6mm. A 5mm hole in the end of the shroud would make it quieter. However, it does make it more temperamental. As the pellet travels through the baffles, it doesn't actually have to come into contact with them in order to cause a problem. Depending on how the air is released from the end of the barrel and how it follows the pellet, having a super tight hole can sometimes cause pellet instability. To be honest with you, I think we would have been alright with the Vulcan, as it's a very efficient rifle, so there isn't tons of turbulent air following the pellet as it travels through the core. However, I can only ever test the rifles 1 day a week, so getting all the way down to Pete's airgun farm to find out the rifle's clipping is a little annoying. So I always go to 6mm for 177 rifles and 7mm for 2.2. It gives 1.5mm of clearance between the pellet and the hole, and I've never had a problem with clipping issues. If you wanted to keep the hole as small as humanly possible, what you would need to do is drill it out to 5mm, test the rifle down range. If it works, brilliant. If not, drill it out to 5.2mm and retest. With that done though, that's pretty much all the drilling done. We can now refit our end cap and drill that out. To do that, we're just mounting the end cap back on the core, center drilling the end, then drilling it out to 6mm using a standard length drill. Doing it this way just ensures that the end cap is perfectly concentric with the core and just ensures that we should have no problems with clipping. Right then, with that all done, that's pretty much all of the lathe work complete for this piece here. We can now move the part over to the mill, start work on milling out the baffle chambers. To begin with, we're going to be starting on the rear section of the core, and the first job is just to mill a flat on one side. Flat, along with the corresponding pocket that we're going to mill into the end, will allow air back through the shroud. So we're creating a flat first, then coming back with our end mill and just milling out a pocket in the middle, and this pocket will be located just in front of the barrel. And to do all this work, we're just going to be using a 3-flute carbide end mill. To mill the pocket, what we're doing first is plunging out most of the waste material, then feeding the end mill down and cleaning up the side walls. We don't need a super duper finish on all of these pieces here, as you will never see them once they're installed into the rifle, but it is always nice to put a serviceable finish on there. With the pocket milled out, we can now flip the piece over and mill the flat on the other side. With that done, that's the rear section complete. We can move on to the midsection. Starting out, what I've gone ahead and done is just mark the rough position of my baffles with a felt tip pen. We can come through with a 8mm drill bit and just drill some pilot holes. These pilot holes just make the end mill's job a little easier, as end mills don't typically like being plunged straight through material. On this particular core, we're going to have 7 baffles, or 8 if you include the end cap. And once we've created our pilot drill, we can start milling the pieces out. We're only going to be doing one on camera, as it's pretty annoying to have the camera in the way of what I'm trying to do. And they're pretty much all identical, although I will say they are slightly different sizes. But to mill them out, we're coming through with our end mill, plunging out most of the waste material, then coming through and cleaning up the walls. This first baffle is 20mm wide by 12mm long. The other baffles in the core are going to be slightly different sizes. The different sizes just help break up the sound profile. You can see a similar thing done on exhaust boxes, but the actual sizes of the baffles are fairly random. With that said, that's all of the baffle chambers milled out. The last thing to do was to drill a hole in the very end. This hole here just allows the air trapped by the front cap to expand back into the baffle core. With that all done, that's the project complete. I'll take you back over to the bench and we'll test it on the rifle. Right then, so with that done, that's the project complete. What I've gone ahead and done is remove the original one, and we can compare it to our new one here. If we take a look at the old one, it does look rather nice with its angled baffles there. So as you can see, they're all angled baffles with the hole sort of offset from the center. Now obviously the hole is central to the shroud, but it's not central to the angle of the baffles, as you can see that there. Our core uses a standard straight baffle setup, and as you can see there, it looks rather nice. Well, I have already tested it, as you can tell by the pellet debris, and it does work absolutely flawlessly. I'm super happy with how it turned out. Now, to be honest with you, in my testings, I haven't found any benefit for using angled baffles in sub 12 pound rifles. In FAC rifles, the angled baffles are definitely quieter. However, in sub 12 pound rifles, I've found the straight baffles to perform very, very slightly better, if not the same. In FAC rifles, you also have to contend with the actual air hitting the baffles, though having a straight baffle is like chucking a bucket of water against a wall. You get a large slap as all the air hits the wall at one time, and an angled baffle just helps dissipate this a little. For sub 12 pound rifles, we don't have to worry about that so much, as the actual amount of air released from the barrel is much less than the FAC rifles. Along with that, we've also got a much smaller hole in our core, so this one is a 6mm hole, whereas the factory one is a 7 or 8mm hole. The actual cores themselves are exactly the same length and don't actually change the length of the shroud in any way. I wanted to keep it all the same so I could use the original outer housing, and I'm happy to say that the new one screws in nice and easily. With that all said, let's get the shroud built up and I'll give you a shot of both of them side by side. Right then, so original one first, and what I'm going to do is place my microphone nice and close to the shroud, so hopefully you can hear the difference between the two. Right then, so hopefully that picks up on camera quite nicely. We did 3 tests there. Firstly, the original one. Secondly, the new core with no felt installed. And then lastly, the new core with felt installed. As I always say, the camera microphone always auto balances the noise levels, so they all sound roughly the same. And to be honest with you, there isn't a massive difference between the factory one and our new one. The sound profile is slightly different. The new shroud has a slightly lower tone, whereas the old shroud had more sort of a ping noise to it. But the addition of the 1/2" UNF just allows us to screw a moderator onto the end if we want to. So this is one that I made years ago now. This is the first aluminium mod I ever made. And as you can see there, that screws on nice and easily. Now, to be honest with you, the rifle is already quiet enough, so what I think I'm going to do for this rifle is make a muzzle brake to go on the end. The muzzle brake will just be a nice decorative feature on the end of the shroud, and hopefully make the rifle nice and unique. And as an added bonus, whilst we've got the mod in the end, I will just give you a little listen to that as well. With that all said, guys, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been useful or interesting, and we'll see you in the next one.